Good evening. Welcome. My name is Greg Mullins, and I'm Academic Dean and Dean of the Library at Evergreen. And in a moment, I will introduce you to this evening's speaker, Jonathan Katz. But first, some words about the Endowed Lecture Series in honor of Cal Anderson that makes tonight's event possible. Cal Anderson was Washington State's first openly gay state legislator. He represented the 43rd Legislative District, that is to say, an area of Seattle that includes Capitol Hill. He was representative in the House of that district from 1987 to 1995, and he was elected to serve the same district as its senator, and he served in that chamber from January 1995 until his death in August of that same year. The cause of his death was AIDS. Many of the people in the audience tonight were born a few years before or after 1995. And for you, I will say that this evening is an opportunity to learn about a crucial period of our history. Those of us who remember the 1980s and the early 1990s remember a period of cataclysmic upheaval. The 1960s and 1970s yielded a sexual revolution. To paraphrase Walt Whitman, we not only opened the door, we unscrewed it from its hinges, and we removed the door jamb itself. And at the same time, unbeknownst to us, a retrovirus was creeping among us, laying the foundations for a global pandemic that would announce itself in 1981 as so-called gay cancer, soon to be named HIV/AIDS. To serve as an openly gay legislator in Washington State in the 1980s meant representing not only the 43rd District, but also the needs of all the LGBT and queer people in Washington State. To serve while living with HIV and AIDS meant fighting for his own life while also fighting for the people he represented. After his passing, friends of Cal generously donated funds to create tonight's Endowed Lecture Series. It's especially fitting that the 2015 Cal Anderson speaker is Professor Jonathan Katz. For Jonathan has also fought on the front lines against AIDS and for LGBTQ people throughout his career. Jonathan Katz is chair of the Department of Art and director of the graduate program in Visual Studies at the University of Buffalo in New York State. He is co-curator with Rakushka of the extraordinary exhibition currently on display at the Tacoma Art Museum, Art AIDS America, about which he will speak this evening, and which I encourage everyone to see before it closes in early January. I should mention that Evergreen is an institutional partner with the Tacoma Art Museum, so entry is free to the museum to any student or employee. Just show your Evergreen ID at the front desk. Jonathan is not a stranger to the Pacific Northwest. He's the co-curator of Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, the first queer art exhibition ever mounted at a major US museum. It opened at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, then traveled to the Brooklyn and the Tacoma museums, winning the Best National Museum Exhibition Award from the International Association of Art Critics and the Best LGBT Nonfiction Book Award from the American Library Association. I first met Jonathan in 1991 in San Francisco. He was wearing a white Queer Nation t-shirt with sleeves tucked up one roll, Levi's, also rolled up, Doc Martens, and pearls. He co-founded Queer Nation as an extension and elaboration for queer politics of the direct action tactics that ACT UP leveraged so successfully to curb discrimination against people living with AIDS and to demand resources for medical care and research. Jonathan was as active in street politics to fight HIV/AIDS as he was finishing his graduate degree. He founded and chaired the first department of gay and lesbian studies in the United States at City College of San Francisco. As an associate professor at Yale University, Jonathan was founding director of its Lesbian and Gay Studies program before moving to his current position at the University of Buffalo. He's currently completing 2 new books. One is titled Art, Eros, and the 60s. The other is called The Silent Camp, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and the Cold War, to be published by the University of Chicago Press. His exhibition entitled Classical Nudes and the Making of Queer History recently closed at the Leslie-Lohman Museum for Gay and Lesbian Art, and his exhibition Art, Text, Art on the relationship between the use of words and American art and sexuality has also just closed in Buffalo, but lives on online. Jonathan has traded in his pearls, at least this evening, but he's never stopped thinking critically about what politics does as art, what art does as politics, and what difference gender and sexuality make to both art and politics. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., Jonathan will offer a gallery talk to more than 100 Evergreen students from both the Tacoma and Olympia campuses. Join us if you can. And please join me right now in welcoming to the podium Jonathan Katz.
Thank you for that really beautiful introduction. I found, much to my great dismay, that pearls and gray hair just don't work well together. Thank you. It is an honor to be able to give this talk named after a man I admire greatly, Cal Anderson. My subject today, that AIDS fundamentally changed American art and culture, should seem self-evident, but all too often that is not the case. For example, more Americans have died from AIDS than all the wars this nation has fought since its independence put together, with the exception of the Civil War. A fact that speaks to the scale and scope of the new plague that beset our nation over 3 decades ago. We readily credit any one of these wars with a profound impact post-war or pre-war. We use them as markers defining our history. And yet of AIDS' impact on our commonality, we are routinely, notably, unjustifiably silent. The thesis that undergirds my newest exhibition, Art AIDS America, is exactly that AIDS is the motor for some of the most substantial changes in the development of American culture up to the present day. It's a large exhibition, 135 works, and I'll be showing you some of them today. And central to the claim is that we repress any account of AIDS' impact in American art the way we've repressed AIDS' impact in every sphere of our culture, a sign, right, of its great power. We repeatedly frame AIDS as a tragic tangent, a sterile byway that has left the art world largely unchanged. My exhibition argues exactly the converse, that AIDS is the single most potent force shaping the development of American art over the last several decades. And in what follows, I'm going to try to prove that admittedly unsubtle, provocative claim. When we discuss AIDS today, that is, when we deign to mention it at all, it seems to assume one of only 2 forms. Either a somber necrology, resulting in the recitation of the dead and our concomitant cultural loss, with or without ritual breastfeeding, or as the historical context for the development of the US culture wars of the early 1980s. And let me show you an image from one of those culture wars. This is the cover of Artform magazine, showing one of the very earliest of all AIDS informed protests. This was the cancellation of the Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition, The Perfect Moment, at the Corcoran. And in response, a group of activists, I'm pleased to say myself included, decided that we would screen images of the banned work onto the marble walls of the museum at night. And so that is precisely what we did. And it made the cover of the magazine. What these twinned responses share, though, is that both serve to safely sequester AIDS in the past, confining it to a social universe that is by definition severed from our own. AIDS is represented as an historical threat, before new drug regimens broke the back of the epidemic and hunted it back to small pockets of chronic ineradicability born of ostensibly what they then called high-risk behavior. Accordingly, AIDS hit some of us harder than others, decimated some communities more than others, but apparently, if we're to read our histories, it apparently grazed us hardly at all. Replicating the us-them dynamic that haunted and impeded early efforts to organize against the threat, AIDS is always their disease, not ours. To make of AIDS an active historical protagonist requires understanding that it is in fact ours, a collective trauma with a collective impact. But the fact that 90% of AIDS art doesn't actually look like AIDS art and isn't understood as AIDS art, whatever its actual themes, is part of the problem. In fact, AIDS art looks like this. I'm showing you Ross Bleckner's Deathlessness from 1987. Like most AIDS art, it's not strident or overtly political. It doesn't use hot-button political slogans or words. It doesn't represent diseased bodies or dying figures. And it doesn't do so, let me underscore, because it couldn't. We too readily forget that in the 1980s, there were laws in place, federal laws, that censored any art about AIDS in the context of desire or sexuality. As a result, an entire generation of artists began to think about their representational practices first and foremost strategically, trying to understand the array of forces marshaled against them and seeking to circumvent, confront, or flout these new AIDS-phobic and homophobic laws. These artists were thus forced to engage in a complicated calculus, whereby any work of art was tested against a complex reading of extant social networks and discursive conditions, prejudices and stereotypes, laws, customs, institutional parameters, to yield a work precisely calibrated to function in the space between possibility and foreclosure, between influence and censorship. Supremely alive to the discursive affect of their work, this AIDS generation of artists learned how to read the weather expertly, frequently tacking or even dissimulating if that was required. Above all, they pioneered a highly self-conscious means of seeding, but never determining a work of art's significance, a way of saying things without attribution, camouflaging their meanings as seamlessly and as self-evidently as many of them camouflage their hand in the art making. To challenge this seeming silence, we must attend not to the macro effects of AIDS, but the micro ones, and most centrally the way it subtly redrew the parameters of art world discourse and thus also redrew artists' own tactical thinking as they sought to represent AIDS. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a sculpture by Scott Burton that camouflages itself as a chair, even calling itself two-part chair. Two-part chair initially sat among a group of other chairs in a New York office tower lobby, seemingly an example of the kind of bland corporate art that was a feature of the 80s boom era. Inoffensive, apolitical, updating, but not necessarily challenging the minimalist aesthetic that still dominated the art world. But look at it again. Do you see how this chair insinuates gay sex, anal intercourse, in fact, unmarked even as one sat in it? Ostensibly, innocently occupying the center hall of repressive authority, two-part chair perfectly encapsulates that strategic thinking that is one legacy of the art of AIDS. Let's look at another work, a sculpture by Felix Gonzalez Torres called Perfect Lovers. It's a strange kind of sculpture because it's actually made out of commercially manufactured clocks, two of them, generally placed above the desk at the entrance to the gallery or museum. But like all such clocks, right, they will eventually, though they were initially timed together, grow out of sync, and eventually one clock's battery will run out, and so will the other one. Perfect Lovers was made after Felix realized that his partner was dying and that he himself was HIV positive. To better understand what this all means, let me quote a statement by the artist. I'm quoting him exactly. At this point, I do not want to be outside the structure of power. I do not want to be the opposition, the alternative. Alternative to what? To power? No, I want to have power. It's effective in terms of change. I want to be like a virus that belongs to the institution. All the ideological apparatuses are, in other words, always replicating themselves because that's the way culture works. So if I function as a virus, an imposter, an infiltrator, I will always replicate myself together with those institutions." End quote. Imposters and infiltrators, of course, succeed only when they are well camouflaged. Dissimulation, hiding, and absolute self-awareness are the hallmarks of their achievement. What Gonzalez-Torres meant by being an infiltrator and imposter nearly 2 decades ago has become almost second nature to young artists today. It's centered on a kind of dissimulation of authoriality, a camouflaged authorness. And an AIDS generation taught contemporary artists the central idea that making a statement did not necessarily entail forthright admission, and that clues, hints, silences, and elisions could possess, in the right context, an unusually expressive eloquence. When an HIV-positive artist not only allies himself with the virus, but discursively even personifies it, as Felix Gonzalez-Torres did in the statement I quoted, we know something really important is happening. When HIV infects a body, its evolutionary stroke of genius is to turn the body's own immune system against itself. The AIDS retrovirus attaches onto a particular infection-fighting white blood cell. They're called CD4 T helper cells, inserting its own RNA into the host cell, where it's converted into DNA. Thus infected, the cell now produces and releases millions of replicas of itself, thereby turning infection-fighting cells into essentially what is an HIV production factory, pumping out new viruses that repeat that process with other cells. And because the infection is housed within the host's own white blood cells, the body's remaining healthy disease-fighting blood cells don't recognize it, and thus do not attack. The immune system eventually exhausts itself, and the host dies from one or another opportunistic infection, thus the word syndrome in AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. In the context of an art world immune system that framed both homosexuality and AIDS as dangerous invaders that needed to be eliminated, numerous artists, beginning as early as 1982, with the first stirrings of what would become, shortly, full-scale culture war, pioneered a new and self-consciously viral approach to confront the exclusionary, defensive, infection-fighting arena that is the museum. In one of the great historical ironies of this era, these artists took HIV, the very virus that was killing them, as the blueprint and the battle plan for a similarly clandestine and camouflaged attack. In their hands, the very glossary of AIDS, viral, clandestine, camouflage, infection, replication, became the lexicon of an art world revolution that knew, like HIV itself, that the immune system was the best vector of attack precisely because once it was infected, it cannot attack itself. These iconic works, like this one, fit that bill. This is a work by Jesper Johns, and it is indeed one of the earliest works about AIDS ever painted. But you're not going to see it in any museum discussed as a work of art about AIDS. It's instead considered one of the most important of Johns's mature works, but the word AIDS is never associated with this painting. That's a shame, because in fact, the painting is profoundly informed by AIDS, as a number of scholars have recognized. It's called Perilous Night, a strange name. And I discovered that the reason it's called Perilous Night is because of that little sheet of music underneath the far arm. You see that sheet of music? It actually is labeled Perilous Night, and Perilous Night is the name of a composition by John Cage, Johns' good friend. And Perilous Night was composed, Cage tells us in an autobiographical statement, at a moment, quote, when love had become unhappy. Now that alone, of course, helps to underscore its relevance to this particular scenario. AIDS, of course, as a moment when love had become unhappy, but more profoundly, Perilous Night was one of the defining works for Cage's intellectual development. Because with Perilous Night, Cage realized something that would inform everything he did subsequently. He realized, in his own words, quote, that expression in music is not possible, end quote. What had happened was that he was divorcing his wife, Xenia, and becoming involved with the partner who would occupy the next 50 years of his life, Merce Cunningham. And in the process, he poured all of his emotions into the work Perilous Night. And then on its premiere, he waited anxiously to see who recognized his trauma. And no one did. And so, and this is central to the paradox I'm trying to pull out, John Cage's refusal of the idea of expression in art becomes the organizing point of Jasper Johns's expressive painting about AIDS that nonetheless, right, refuses to use any of the terms of expression we normally acknowledge or recognize. It even refuses to articulate itself as in any way autobiographical. There's a print in this painting. That print is called Between the Clock and the Bed. It's that thing right in the middle that Johns did with the green and the orange and the purple. It comes from this work, Edward Monk's self-portrait Between the Clock and the Bed. But Johns gets rid of the word self-portrait, leaving just Between the Clock and the Bed as the title. He uses the chevron that's in the bedspread, right? That clearly informs Johns's image. But where the artist stands in Johns, there is merely an absence. Moreover, Perilous Night contains another image, upside down and reversed, a figure drawn from one of the most important Renaissance paintings, a painting called the Eisenheim Altarpiece by the Renaissance master Matthias Grunwald from 1512 to 1516. And that figure is barely visible in that weird area just beneath the arms that seems spotted with dots vaguely evoking Kaposi sarcoma, the lesions that people with AIDS then were experiencing. Now, a bit of background. The Eisenheim altarpiece was made for a hospital, for people who were suffering from skin diseases, particularly one called St. Vitus dance, a skin disease that was produced by eating essentially rotten rye grain. It caused extraordinary physical symptoms, especially pustules that leaked and were filled with pus. Every figure, here is the Christ, every figure in the Eisenheim altarpiece has tortured skin, obviously in a means of connecting, right, religious salvation to those then suffering. And it's this figure that is the upside down and reversed figure that I had talked about. It's from a panel, and clearly you can see the pustules and the pus coming out of his body, looking very much like Kaposi sarcoma, and thus presumably informing Jasper Johns's choice. Here's another work from 1982, in which you can see more clearly both the figure, the arm, and the musical composition. Now, 1982 is remarkably early. It's the year that the first news articles, widely distributed news articles addressing AIDS appeared. So it's literally coterminous with the first appearance of the disease in the United States. But even Johns's early work related to AIDS has never been understood in these terms. It's remarkable that these iconic works of a generation of artists informed by AIDS seem to have very little in common. Compare, for example, works by Jasper Johns to this work by Felix Gonzalez Torres, untitled North. Yet these artists successfully found a way to instrumentalize most of the key directions taken up by contemporary American art to that point, and to lend them a peculiar form of political content and expressive possibility. In turning the work's formal or inward-looking innovations outward towards their audience, they found a way to make art address AIDS connotatively, but rarely denotatively. Fully aware of the politics of the moment, they knew that to name AIDS directly was, by definition, excluded. And so they made their audience an expressive ally, capable of reading the meanings they knew never to state directly. Look at Untitled North. It's a curtain of light, right? And a curtain of light raises complicated metaphors of transcendence, of heaven, of placement before one side of the curtain and the other side of the curtain, but none of that is explicit. This is what Felix Gonzalez Torres had to say. I quote him again. "I love the idea of being an infiltrator. I always said that I wanted to be a spy. I want my artwork to look like something else, not artistic, yet beautifully simple. I don't want to be the opposition, because the opposition always serves a purpose. It says, improve your arms against me. But if you're the spy, always straight acting within their system, you are the person they fear the most, because you're one of them, and you've become impossible to define." End quote. Formally and theoretically sophisticated, spare, and elegant, AIDS artists like Gonzalez Torres evaded the art world's immune system precisely to the degree that their work became the material obverse of a recognizable image of either homosexuality or AIDS. Instead of either hot politics or messy embodiment, a figuration redolent of sex and leaking infected bodily fluids, these artists chose a cool, post-minimalist abstraction, the calculated language of the spy. Tellingly, this camouflage, clandestine language of the spy seems to echo an earlier avant-garde moment equally associated with a similar expressive opacity and strategic self-positioning. I'm referring to the immediately post-abstract expressionist art of figures like John Cage, Jasper Johns, and Robert Rauschenberg. The parallel is very much to the point. Queer artists in the virulently homophobic 50s, subjected to gay baiting from the federal level on down, shared a culture not dissimilar from the virulently homophobic art world at the time of AIDS's worst ravages. And importantly, the language that Felix Gonzalez Torres is here using, the spy language, is actually the McCarthy-era metaphor of homosexuality. Today, we, of course, use the metaphor of the closet, but it's a delimited metaphor. It's binary. You're in or you're out. And, of course, sexuality is much more complicated than that. We've been delimited by our reliance on the metaphor of the closet. The earlier metaphor, the 50s metaphor, is the spy. And, of course, what's great about the spy is it's a mobile identity. It shifts and changes according to circumstance, and you can be in and out at the same moment, depending on who's watching. I'm showing you Grand Fury's Let the Record Show, the literal first museum exhibition about AIDS. It's a complex work. It was shown in the window of the New Museum in New York when the New Museum was actually an avant-garde institution. Now it's just a big, nasty museum like all the other ones. But what's striking about Let the Record Show is that it was organized by a guy named Bill Olander, a good friend of mine, who had the misfortune of articulating that he was HIV positive in the early days of AIDS and thus was unemployed as a museum director or curator for many years until finally the New Museum gave him a position. And one of the first things Bill did, bless his heart, was to commission this window. And what the Let the Record Show does is create a very complicated political metaphor. Of course, it's famous for the silence equals death logo that dominates the top part of the image. But in addition, what is perhaps not so self-evident is that it's a complex political metaphor relying on the notion of the Holocaust. That is, in fact, right, a photo of the Nuremberg trials of former Nazis going on in Germany. And in front of it, though it's very hard to make out in this photograph, there are 7 heads. Each of those 7 heads belongs to what the piece called an AIDS criminal. And it was, they were then lit sequentially, rather fancy technologically for the period. And in front of them, there's a white screen with their AIDS words on it. William F. Buckley, for example, is quoted as having said that people with HIV should have the word HIV tattooed on their left buttock and be confined to concentration camps. He actually wrote this. So these AIDS criminals were, of course, being attacked in the work. The one figure who doesn't have any words associated with him is the guy that's lit up here. That's Ronald Reagan. And that's because Ronald Reagan did not yet utter the word AIDS in 1987, despite the fact that over 100,000 Americans had already died. When he finally did, by the way, his press secretary said, well, he hadn't said the word AIDS up till the present moment because it was clear that AIDS had not yet spread into the general population, which, given the fact that I had phone books filled with the names of dead people, always made me wonder what exactly population he was talking about. None of these new art world strategies can make fully any sense unless arrayed against this overheated social and political context. This was, after all, the era of the culture wars, when cynical right-wing politicians instrumentalized the dead and the dying to advance their own political agenda. Given the extremely aggressive political, which is to say ideological control by demagogues in Congress like Jesse Helms, Republican of North Carolina, over, for example, the National Endowment for the Arts, few in the art world cared to invite controversy into their institutions. In fact, from the mid-'80s until the early 1990s, coinciding, in fact, with the resurgence of the Republican right under Reaganism, American museums, by and large, turned themselves into an analog of the immune system. And the virus they sought to attack and destroy was any art that referenced homosexuality and its then inevitable shadow, AIDS. When, on June 12, 1989, Christina Orr Cahill, director of the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, canceled that Robert Mapplethorpe retrospective a few weeks before its opening, and a few months after the photographer had died of AIDS, she was, in her own words, protecting her museum. By this point, the question of federal support for any art that even tangentially acknowledged either queerness or AIDS had been so repeatedly and brilliantly manipulated into a wedge issue by the Christian right that in the Republic-dominated sentence, content restrictions were very easily voted into place. And these content restrictions overwhelmingly turned on the question of the representation of sexuality, and homosexuality in particular was defined as inherently, necessarily obscene. Thus, when the immune system attacked, it did so mercilessly, seeking to eradicate any visible reference to either AIDS or queer lives. In October 1987, Helms successfully pushed through an amendment to a huge AIDS research and education bill that, in the words of the piece of legislation itself, and here I quote it, prohibit the use of any funds provided under this act to the Center of Disease Control for being used to provide AIDS education, information, or prevention materials and activities that promote, encourage, or condone homosexuality or the intravenous use of illegal drugs, end quote. He thus managed to do something quite remarkable: fund and cripple the agency charged with protecting our national health, and what was tantamount to calling for a death sentence for the two most at-risk populations. And in a chilling barometer of the national mood, Helms's blatantly discriminatory, blatantly homophobic and AIDS-phobic amendment passed the Senate by a vote of 94 in favor and 2 against. 2. Lowell Weicker, Republican of Connecticut, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat of New York. They were the only no votes. As artist A.A. Bronson of the collective General Idea noted in an interview about this moment, quote, "Sexuality was a kind of dangerous subject in the art world. To call yourself a gay artist would, of course, have been the death knell of your career," end quote. And this is a work by General Idea and A.A. Bronson. Oh, the idea dropped out and it just reads General, sorry about that. This is called A Year and a Day of AZT. They are, of course, AZT pills, but made to look also like minimalist abstraction. So again, it circulates in the museum camouflaged. The title tells you what it's about, but otherwise, there's no really way of seeing AIDS in it. And of course, the large pills are 1 day of AZT, and the smaller pills are 1 year of AZT, AZT being, of course, the first HIV drug. But let's not assume that the sleight of hand, ideological sleight of hand, resulting in the equation of gay art and AIDS was exclusively a product of senatorial demagoguery. As the controversy swirled around the censorship of the Mapplethorpe exhibition at the Corcoran, the Washington Post's editorial board took pains to deny that homophobia was a significant factor in the cancellation of the exhibition. And the National Gallery's very famous director, J. Carter Brown at the time, furthered this orphaning of queer art by advocating a politically astute, if morally bankrupt, division between gay subject matter and the civil rights implications of its censorship. He said, quote, "This is not a First Amendment controversy." This homophobic, AIDS-phobic immune response ensured that museums, by and large, came to regard the conjunction of AIDS and sexuality as the proverbial third rail, and that is still true, I want to underscore, even 25 years later, as I came to understand in trying to circulate Art AIDS America to the over 150 museums that turned the exhibition down. It's not showing in San Francisco, for example. It's not showing it in any museum in California. In fact, this is a work by General Idea that speaks to it. It's called White AIDS. And it's the use of the word AIDS exactly as Robert Indiana's famous love, L-O-V-E, but here, of course, A-I-D-S. But it's all done in white. So the paintings have the word AIDS in white on a white ground. And then notably, it's also placed on wallpaper with the word AIDS on a white ground. So AIDS is literally everywhere, and nobody can read it. Nobody sees it. Another artist in this exhibition, Jimmy DeSana, put it in 1990 a different way. And I'm showing you here his gooseberries from '87. Can anybody read what hides behind those beautiful lanterns? Anybody? Deathlessness. Yes, exactly. So subtly, right? Deathlessness. This is what he wrote. There is a realization as a gay person in the art world there is now a little distancing from the mainstream. This is something I never even considered 10 years ago. I never even thought about it until the AIDS epidemic appeared. It has pulled the art world together. But in a way, I think it's separated the gays from the regular heterosexual crowd, which I think is pretty dominant in the art world right now, end quote. But in order to better understand what happened to separate gays from that regular heterosexual crowd, allow me to take us back to the moment just before the advent of the culture wars. And I think you're going to be surprised by this. Who is that? Nancy Reagan on the cover of Interview magazine, Warhol's gay rag. Indeed, in this issue of Interview, if you open it up, you will find Robert Mapplethorpe photographs inside. Clearly, this is from a moment before the camps had divided. In fact, Nancy Reagan refused to give any interviews shortly after occupying the White House because her press staff told her to hold out for Interview magazine as her premiere interview. She wanted to be in this gay rag precisely because, right, republicanism was uncool, and being in Warhol's publication would lend the imprimatur of coolness to her and, by extension, to Ronnie. So we see her here, and yet, of course, just a year or two later, everything would change. This is 1981. When mass media reports of that new disease began to emerge in the spring and summer of this year, 1981, a New York Times news story dated July 3rd, 1981, addressed an unusual outbreak of Kaposi sarcoma in previously healthy young gay men. They called it first gay cancer, then they called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, always specifically naming gays as the target population. Although the more accurate name AIDS was not adopted until late 1982, the damage was already done. And to this day in the United States, AIDS is still profoundly associated with homosexuality, despite, right, evidence to the contrary from most other nations of the globe. The political and social ramifications of that epidemiological association would first hobble, but then subsequently energize, via direct action protest groups like ACT UP, the political will to fight the epidemic. And concurrent with the rise of the new epidemic, a new kind of art and a new kind of art criticism were coming to the fore. We can call that new kind of art, and I use this term in the most general way possible, postmodernist. I want to talk a little bit about the history of postmodernism briefly. And I want to address it, specifically using the work of the French artist Daniel Buren, who was considered a political artist at the time. This is what politically charged artwork looked like circa 1977, the kind that the art world and its critics praised as politically effective and politically engaged. Daniel Buren was a leading exponent of that moment, and he took what was then taken to be highly charged, inherently political look at the conditions of representation in the museum. And he did it by making these stripes appear in a doorway, along the wall, and then you see them follow outside the museum and onto the courtyard, and eventually, and this is in a subsequent piece, onto mass transportation, here and here. So it was supposed to be a work of art that talked about and examined, analyzed, right, the parameters of inclusion and exclusion in the museum. But of course, with none of the social or political ramifications of that term, it was literally about what was in and outside the museum, and that was politics, according to postmodernism. In place of an analysis of who was actually permitted representation, Buren made a work that instead literalized the simple fact. His work took the look of minimalism and added a dash of philosophical ethics, yielding a postmodernist brew with a heady odor of political engagement, but none of the messy to and fro of actual political commitment. Here was a way to feel deeply principled and still leave the mechanisms of museum representation fundamentally unchanged. Arguably, this new postmodernist tendency had its beginning in 1976 with the inaugural publication of what would become the house organ and the cheerleader of this kind of postmodernist theory. I'm referring to the magazine October and to a very significant exhibition curated by its then editor, managing editor Douglas Crimp, an exhibition called Pictures at Artist Space in New York. The group of artists featured in this exhibition named by Crimp subsequently as the Pictures generation, had turned away from minimalism towards a new series of aesthetic strategies largely rooted in French cultural theory of the 1960s and 70s. The theory that was first translated into English and anthologized only towards the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. As postmodernist art theory began to challenge business as usual in the art world, one short text above all others came to assume a position of prominence. And that short text was Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. That's its English title. And it was initially published in English in the legendary American avant-garde journal Aspen in 1967, only to be repatriated and published in French in that defining year of French political life, 1968. But The Death of the Author, that article, The Death of the Author, achieved new currency and a permanent spot on American college syllabi only after it was anthologized in a book of Barthes' writing called Image, Music, Text, first published in translation in 1977, a few years before the first cluster of AIDS cases was reported. Countering the common notion that it is the author who determines the meaning of a text, Barthes argued in this article that it is instead always the readers who make meaning, the reader or audience who make up the text's meaning in the act of reading it. In The Death of the Author, Barthes elevated what he termed readerly activity, the interpretive act of reading, ahead of what he called writerly activity, the province of the text author, even going so far as to argue that, as the title underscores, we have no real need of authors because all meanings are inherently a product of the audience's cognition. Despite the fact that Foucault effectively gutted many of Barthes' earlier claims in his subsequent, much more historically reasoned article, What is an Author from 1969, Barthes' arguments nonetheless significantly steered the development of American postmodernist theory. And it looked like this. When Sherry Levine rephotographed Walker Evans's famous Dust Bowl images, first published in 1941 in Evans and Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and showed them, without commentary, as her own photographs in a 19 exhibition at Metro Pictures called After Walker Evans, she was seen as materializing Barthes' influential ideas on the death of the author. Evans' photographs were right appropriated. And what could be more death of the author right than to take something by another author and claim it as your own? The photographs were originally, however, intended as a form of progressive political reportage, albeit particularly refined, and their activist intent was underscored in the text which said, and I quote, "Above all else, in God's name, don't think of this as art," end quote. Yet interestingly, at the time that these were rephotographed, no critics noted the peculiar irony of restaging Evans's fervent call for social justice in the white-walled confines of a temple to that highest commodity value, the commercial art gallery. Here are some more photographs. Oops, damn it, I keep doing that. And each of these were intended as separate. I've just put them all together so you could see them all together. But then, how could these photographs manifest any relation to a social and political context of crushing, lethal Depression-era poverty when intention was defined as authorial and thus irrelevant in an era of the death of the author? As Levine wrote in her 1981 author's statement, and I will quote her statement, "We know that a picture is but a space in which a variety of images, none of them original, blend and clash. A picture is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. We can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original." Now that's the end of the quote. Now I want to make a point. Like her photographs themselves, Levine's artist statement was itself an appropriation. She took and condensed the exact language of Barthes' article, The Death of the Author, changing the word text to picture and used it as her own artist statement. Already, at this relatively early stage, we can glimpse some of the lineaments of what would shortly become postmodernism's peculiar relation to the social world it would claim to demystify. Ironically, for a critical method rooted in exposing hidden ideology, postmodernist criticism apparently did not see or did not care that these had once been activist works of art. To their mind, a self-consciously activist art only reproduced a simplistic account of expressive intent, the artist wanting to express something, that ignored the many ways that a statement was always bound up in a complex web of social meanings. Indeed, activist art was seen as a kind of false consciousness for its implicit claim to a direct, which is to say privileged or unmediated relationship between intent and the society. In a 1982 article in October called Subversive Signs, the famous art historian and theorist Hal Foster celebrated this new postmodernist politics, and his hope for the future turned on the liberatory potential in the death of the author. He explicitly compared several male artists, such as this one, Alan McCullum. This is his Plaster Surrogates of 1982. And you can see again how the death of the author is realized in the art world. He was once a very famous artist. He made essentially pictures that were empty, frames that he hung with nothing in them to emphasize the degree to which meaning was always a product of viewer cognition. Here's another work. As you can see, they look rather alike. And then he explicitly compared these male artists, and he included here another figure, David Solly, who used random conjunctions. He was probably the most famous artist of the moment. This is his brain from 1984. Its sexism never, of course, addressed. He compared them to several female artists, such as Barbara Kruger, Jenny Holzer. But rather than noting the stark differences between the male and female artists and their works, differences I'll underscore shortly, he actually saw them as a collective endeavor unified in their common rejection of an authorial voice and identity. Thus, Levine's critical move and appropriation and instantiation of the death of the author par excellence quickly became a hallmark of postmodernist art in the early 1980s. And undergirding the work's self-conscious anti-originality was Barth's now famous essay. But look at this, and you'll see that it operates very differently. Holzer is here taking condoms, using exactly the kind of text that would have originally appeared on a condom package, but writing logos like, "In a dream you saw a way to survive and were full of joy," or "Expiring for love is beautiful but stupid." And she's doing these in 1983, among the earliest works of art ever produced. So it leads me to ask this question. What happens to the death of the author when the death of the author ceases to be a metaphor? What happens to a metaphor when a grim social reality overwhelms its connotations and turns it literal? The answer is both nothing and everything. First, the nothing. The art press ranked behind the mainstream press in terms of AIDS coverage, and there was almost no acknowledgement of the rising tide of death beyond the requisite necrology until well into the 1980s, around the time the first museum exhibitions started happening. This, mind you, 8 years after the syndrome was identified, amidst over 100,000 dead. October itself didn't mention AIDS until 1988. But feminist artists such as Holzer certainly noticed what was happening much earlier, and their art was inflected by a desire to put this questioning of who can speak, and in what context they can speak, and in what context they can enter the museum, into political practice, a very different kind of political practice than Daniel Buren's. The very title of these works conforms to one of the most enduring legacies of AIDS and its various dissimulations. Holzer labels each work untitled And then, after that generic untitled, she gives it a sharp specificity inside the parentheses. And you saw that earlier with Felix Gonzalez Torres's untitled North. In fact, you will see the same format, untitled as the work of art's name, plus the parenthetical descriptive title, become what is now standard art world practice. I challenge you, you'll see it everywhere now. But it's born of this moment. And it's born of this moment for a particular reason. Because it allowed the artist to claim their work was simply untitled, classic death of the author, right? And yet it also created the opportunity for the artist to expressively signify inside the parentheses to those of us who cared to read it. With this untitled plus parentheses format, an AIDS-inflected work could at once nod to prevailing postmodernist anti-expressivity, while at the same time cluing the viewer into what the work was really about. Hardly genuinely anti-authorial, Holzer's work is among the earliest instantiations of the kind of camouflaged, infiltrating, imposter-driven artwork that Felix Gonzalez Torres explicitly tied to AIDS nearly a decade later. Only poetically postmodernist, Holzer here demonstrates how every discourse is open to sabotage, how counter-discourses flourish best under cover of orthodoxy. Among the first stirrings of a new kind of postmodernism is we can see in this early work by Barbara Kruger, which takes the prevailing authorial self-silencing into expressly political or even activist territory. It reads, after all, "Your comfort is my silence." Using the same now familiar untitled format, again, first word untitled, Kruger deploys shifting points of reference, such as my or yours, which allow the viewer to ironize the ideology of the death of the author. And Jenny Holzer plays with the authorial voice herself in ways that switch gender, and in the process transforms what could be merely postmodernist play into an aggressively engaged and feminist account of the gendered terms of meaning-making. Here, writing, "Someone wants to cut a hole in you and fuck you through it, buddy." Or here, it's an odd feeling. This is, by the way, a bronze plaque, the kind that you would find on a building. It's an odd feeling when you trigger instinctive behavior like nursing in someone. It's funny to be in his presence while a different part of the nervous system takes over and his eyes get strange. Right, completely inverting the traditional norms by which such statements are uttered. But notice how subtle, even camouflaged, these politically inflected works really are. So subtle in their operations that Hal Foster saw them merely as an example of the death of the author. He claimed that their use of different voices was an example of the death of the author, not a form of political engagement. Artists such as Holzer and Kruger and Johns and Gonzalez Torres then counted on postmodernist anti-authoriality and its refusal to credit intention, and were thus able to seed their work with a range of personal and expressive meanings they knew that a theoretically sophisticated audience trained in the death of the author would not see, or at least would not feel compelled to articulate. At the same time, they also knew that a broad general public would find these other meanings captivating. My point is that October's generalized suspicion of queer meanings had an unanticipated benefit for an AIDS-informed art in an era of grave constraints on representation and a general art world cowardice when it came to challenging those constraints. Postmodernism's refusal of intention provided an out, giving institutional AIDS phobia, homophobia, or simple cowardice a motivated intellectual rationale, a gloss of sophisticated anti-authorial theory to camouflage its more base instincts. Remarkably, this attitude allowed artists to address AIDS, if done with the right touch, directly under the noses of both Philistines like Jesse Helms and art world sophisticates like Hal Foster, confident that the viral meanings of such artwork would always operate either below or above their frequencies, either too high or too low to be detected. And even more, the art world could point to postmodernist theory's denigration of authoriality to rationalize its own refusal of meaning in the context of postmodernism, and to articulate the now dangerous identity politics that Helms and company sought to police. The artwork could then frame its silence not as cowardice, but as the more progressive political position. And here's the kicker. In the face of the presumption that art about AIDS held fast to a woefully under-theorized belief in expression, an art that refused to articulate a politics around AIDS was actually the more, they said, engaged, the more of its moment, and finally the more dissident or resistant. I'm showing you one of Jenny Holzer's laments engraved on the lid of a black sarcophagus. It reads, and you can see at the top there, "The new disease came. I learned that time does not heal. Everything gets worse with days. I have spots like a dog. I cough and cannot turn my head." And it concludes, achingly, "I want to go to the future, please." End quote. Hardly anti-authorial. This is a work that ventriloquizes another voice for expressly emotional and political purpose. Something similar is happening here in Paul Tech's Dust, whose one-word subject and title completed the year the artist died of AIDS, from its complications, hardly right without significance. But I think perhaps the clearest instance of what I'm addressing is here, in Andres Serrano's extraordinary photograph, Milk Blood. Looking like nothing so much as typical hard-edged American abstract painting, it could be an Ellsworth Kelly, for example. The photograph insinuates its AIDS politics indirectly in a title and subject, of course dedicated to common vectors of HIV transmission. Not surprisingly, other works in the series are entitled, for example, Blood, Semen. I hope by now that it is clear that there were two powerful streams converging on AIDS in the first decade and a half of the epidemic: the aggressively homophobic discourse of a resurgent religious right enabled by Reagan and Bush, and a much less vituperative but equally chilling theoretical discourse that worked hard to place expressive intent, authorial intention, out of bounds, and with it, any account of biography or politics. Together, these two vastly different social forces policed the representation of AIDS, one brutally, the other with kid gloves. But the net effect was that Helms and Foster, from their opposite perches and with very different agendas, nonetheless produced a virtual art world omerta around AIDS in the face of the most vicious attacks on freedom of expression since McCarthyism. And once so many authors had died their double deaths, one death literal, the other figurative, few remained to puncture that expedient silence. But Foucault reminds us that every discourse, no matter how oppressive, engenders a counter-discourse, a new way of thinking and framing that challenges the initial oppression in new and often unpredictable ways. In the context of these two strong immune responses, which sought from high and low to banish the prospect of addressing AIDS, a new variant on postmodernism was born. And that variant's central characteristic was what González Torres termed spy techniques, viral techniques, a form of art making that operated strategically and stealthily to suggest meanings it knew never to declare openly. Postmodernism's elevation of the audience ahead of the author proved precisely the cover that these artists needed to appear at once, depending on the viewer's perspective, either as the instantiation of a fundamentally postmodern anti-authoriality, or conversely, as the maker of works laden with expressive intent. So let me just show you a few. This is David Wojnarowicz's untitled Buffalo. There's that title again. An appropriation, it is literally a photograph of a diorama in the American Museum of Natural History. A diorama that describes, right, indigenous hunting techniques, but in the context of AIDS, it assumes a completely different level of signification. Or here, Felix Gonzalez Torres put up 21 billboards with this image around New York, mostly in Soho, the art district. I saw them. And when they first went up, I thought, I'm embarrassed to admit, that these were ads for what, Bed Bath & Beyond? And they were one of those teaser campaigns, and subsequently, right, the logo would appear along with, discount 50%. But in fact, right, over time, I came to understand what they were about. These two quiet, silent indentations in pillows. And, of course, the horror hit me. It also hit Felix Gonzalez Torres' friend, Ronnie Horn, who created a remarkable work, Gold Mats Paired for Ross and Felix, two thinly beaten sheets of gold. And if you know anything about gold, it alternately, right, has magnetic attraction and repulsion, so it's constantly moving back and forth. And these are two gold sheets that constantly, as a consequence, right, ruffle, especially as people move through the audience. A beautiful, right, metaphor for Felix and his then dead lover, Ross. And this work, a curtain called Untitled Blood, at a moment, and it's really hard to emphasize how powerful this moment was, when blood was so associated with HIV infection that when this work first appeared in art museums, I watched as members of the public hesitated before walking underneath these plastic curtains. So visceral, so powerful was that association that they didn't even want it to touch them. And then Jim Hodges taking those curtains and turning them into beautiful works made out of sewn flowers, plastic flowers, fragile flowers, that he sews together into curtains. Or Joey Terrell, an artist from Los Angeles, who takes Tom Wesselman's pop art masterpieces, the Great American Breakfast series, which looked like just, sort of typical tables with typical brands, Kellogg's, Cornflake, etc., but insinuates, right, AIDS. Here, Still Life with Zerit. Zerit is an AIDS drug, an early AIDS drug. There you see the package and the Z from Zerit, along with various emblems of his Latino identity. Or Donald Moffat's really moving photograph that simply says, "Safe journey to some safe place." But, right, follows it up with a really humorous, "By accident, I lick all the wrong holes over and over again." Frank Moore's Lullaby, in which the emblem of the buffalo and their hunting to extinction now takes place on a hospital bed. You can see this as AIDS, of course, but it doesn't make you do it that way. Or here, and in closing, the San Francisco artist Rudy Lemke, citing, in fact, an idea born of John Cage, taking us all the way back to the beginning. John Cage created a new form of lecture he called Mesodics, in which he spelled the names of composers or friends down the middle of groups of words that he pulled at random from Finnegan's Wake, the novel by James Joyce. But Lemke doesn't pull at random. He goes back to Finnegan's Wake and with great intention searches words that fill his authorial meanings, his intentions. And this becomes not Finnegan's Wake, but Finn Again's Wake. And two of the works are in the exhibition. pawnbrokers monopolized desperation. And if you read down it vertically, you'll see AZT. And then the other one, Fuggus, suddenly, lost chance. These are quotes pulled directly from Finnegan's Wake. Rassembling, certainly imperfect sight. Notice that all of the words here deal with vision, and it is spelling the word foscarnet, the first drug to fight AIDS-related blindness. And so my point is perhaps, I think, emblematized by a work like this, which is to say that under pressure of AIDS, the random, the anti-authorial, the anti-expressive failed. And artists found new ways to make meaning under a political and social context in which they could camouflage their meaning-making under postmodernist theory. Thank you.